Member for St. Albert, Edmonton.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to rise this afternoon to participate in the debate on the question of privilege. Mr. Speaker, for some Canadians, this debate may seem a little bit antiquated, a little bit technical. They may not fully understand what it is that we're talking about. But notwithstanding that, Mr. Speaker, make no mistake about it. The debate today is a debate of importance. It is a debate of high importance because it goes to the foundations of our democracy. It goes to the heart of the ability of members of Parliament to perform their functions to collectively represent Canadians. Having regard for the importance of this debate on privilege, it is disappointing to see that this Liberal government has responded by trying to shut down debate, by trying to silence members of Parliament, by bringing forward time allocation. Mr. Speaker, Canadians will remember during the last election that the Prime Minister talked so much about sunny ways. He waxed and waned eloquently. He talked about how there would be sunlight brought into this place and how everything would be wonderful, that members would be able to speak and vote freely, and that we would have a government that respected the will of Parliament. And he admonished the previous Conservative government for bringing in time allocation, which of course is perfectly within the rules. It's in the standing orders. Mr. Speaker, that was fair. There were a lot of Canadians who accepted that, who said perhaps Parliament could work better, and entrusted the Prime Minister to deliver. Mr. Speaker, what we have seen, like so much of what we see from the Prime Minister, is that the words that he espoused during the election campaign were nothing more than empty words, because, Mr. Speaker, on this debate, he is trying to shut down debate. This government is trying to shut down debate, but it's not just on this issue, it's on multiple issues. The government has moved time allocation more than a dozen times already. Mr. Speaker, what is even worse is that the government House Leader has now indicated that the government will use this issue as a pretext to invoke time allocation on a regular basis. So we have now a complete 180-degree turnaround from this government. 18, 19 months ago, they were admonishing the previous Conservative government for imposing time allocation. And now, today, the government House Leader is talking about bringing in time allocation all the time, regularly, and with enthusiasm. Mr. Speaker, it really speaks to the trust, or the lack of trust, that Canadians should have in this government. And I think every day more and more Canadians recognize that this government simply can't be trusted. Mr. Speaker, to the substance of this important debate, this issue of privilege, it arose on the day of the budget when the honourable members for Beauce and Milton had their access to the parliamentary precincts to be able to get into this chamber to vote impeded upon. Their access was impeded upon when they tried to access a bus, a House of Commons bus, to come to the chamber to vote, to do what honourable members should do. The bells were ringing, they waited, they saw a bus coming. The bus driver apparently saw them, but the bus couldn't get to them because the bus was stopped. It was blocked by either the Prime Minister's empty motorcade or a media bus, or a combination of the two. But nonetheless, it was blocked, and it was blocked, according to the honourable member for Beauce, for some 9 minutes. And as a result, the honourable members for Milton and Beauce were unable to vote. Those honourable members upon the conclusion of that vote, rose in their places and immediately alerted this House to the fact that their access to this House was impeded upon, that their ability to do their job, to do what their constituents have sent them here to do, and what their constituents expect them to do, and that is to vote on matters before the House of Commons had been prevented, and that consequently there had been a breach of their parliamentary privilege. Upon hearing the evidence from the honourable members for Bose and Milton, the Speaker, Mr. Speaker, you ruled that indeed there was a prima facie case, a prima facie breach of members' privilege. Mr. Speaker, what should have happened then, what has always happened upon the Speaker's finding of a prima facie breach of privilege, is for a debate to take place in this chamber and for a vote to take place, and in the event that the members of this House affirmed the ruling of the Speaker in finding that there was in fact a breach of privilege, that the matter would then be referred to the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs so that the issue of privilege could be studied and that the committee could get to the bottom of exactly what happened. Mr. Speaker, that's not what happened in this case. What should have happened didn't happen because, Mr. Speaker, this government decided instead that they wanted to attack the rights of honourable members to defend and protect the privileges of this House. What this government did in that regard was to bring forward a motion to proceed to orders of the day. And in so doing, what this government did was shut down the ability of honourable members to debate the issue of privilege, to vote on the issue of privilege, and to have the matter referred to the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs, where it would have received precedence at that committee, just as it receives precedence in this House upon the Speaker's finding. Mr. Speaker, what the government did was unprecedented. No government has done what this government did before. And what this government did was very serious. It was fundamentally an attack on this place. It was an attack on this institution, and it was an attack on all honourable members. Because the ability to debate a question of privilege and to vote on a question of privilege is no small matter. It is significant. It is fundamental. It is fundamental to the ability of members of Parliament to perform the functions of a member of Parliament. It is fundamental to the ability of members of Parliament to do their job. That's why, Mr. Speaker, privilege is not the property of the government. It is the property of this chamber. It is the property of all 338 members of Parliament. Mr. Speaker, to understand the significance of what the government tried to do, it perhaps is important to have some understanding of the history of privilege, the foundation of privilege. Mr. Speaker, privilege goes back centuries. It goes back to the 14th and 15th centuries, to the United Kingdom, when the king would interfere, impede, obstruct, use force, in some cases arrest honourable members of Parliament, attacking and impeding their ability to do their jobs. Mr. Speaker, Sir Thomas More was one of the first speakers of the House of Commons who petitioned the King for the recognition of certain privileges of the House. And those privileges included the right to be free from interference and obstruction and use of force by the King and his executive in the House of Lords. Mr. Speaker, privilege, really what it turned out to be was a compromise between the King and the executive and members of Parliament, that Parliament, the House of Commons, would be a place where members could speak freely and debate freely and criticize and oppose the government without interference from the executive. Mr. Speaker, in Canada, privilege was imported from the United Kingdom, and of course, the type of force and arrests and intimidation that British members of Parliament had endured in the 14th and 15th centuries had passed. And by the time of Canada's Confederation, however, what had not passed was the significance of members' privilege, of parliamentary privilege. That's why, Mr. Speaker, parliamentary privilege was enshrined in our Constitution. At Section 18 of the Constitution Act of 1867, it provides that this House may define members' privileges, provided that those privileges do not exceed the privileges enjoyed by members of the British House of Commons at the time of Confederation in 1867. And indeed, this House, through the Act of Parliament, adopted all of those privileges, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, among those privileges is freedom from obstruction and interference. Mr. Speaker, that is precisely what this issue, this question of privilege relates to. The obstruction, the interference of the honourable members for Beauce and Milton's access to come to this chamber to perform really the most important function of a member of Parliament, and that is to stand up and vote on behalf of their constituents. So, Mr. Speaker, when we talk about the issue of privilege, we're talking about something that has been constitutionally protected. We're talking about something that has been protected by our courts. We're talking about something that has been protected by the common law, Mr. Speaker. And it is why what this government sought to do, to prevent members of Parliament from having an opportunity to debate and vote on privilege, is so significant. And, Mr. Speaker, when the government was alerted to the fact, when the arguments were put forward to the government about the seriousness of what they were doing, about the consequences of what they were doing, the response of the government was more or less, we don't care. We don't care. Mr. Speaker, maybe given some of the actions of this government, when it comes to the disrespect that it has exhibited to this chamber, to this institution, perhaps we shouldn't be surprised that that was their attitude. But, Mr. Speaker, Canadians should be surprised that one by one, Liberal MP after Liberal MP after Liberal MP stood up and voted in favour of the government extinguishing the ability of members of Parliament to defend and protect their privileges. It seems, Mr. Speaker, that a lot of members over there perhaps forgot, or maybe they don't care, that they're not members of the government, other than those Liberal MPs who are members of Cabinet. And perhaps they lost sight of the fact that members' privileges are privileges that don't just protect opposition members and enable opposition members to do their work on behalf of their constituents. Members' privileges protect all members of this House, including government backbench MPs, so that they can carry out their job as well. Mr. Speaker, in fact, it is unfortunate that it took the honourable member for Perth Wellington, my colleague, to stand up and question whether or not the government could, in fact, shut down a debate on privilege without a vote. He argued that that was a violation of privilege. Now, you, Mr. Speaker, agreed with the honourable member for Perth Wellington. And so as a result of that ruling, we are having a debate on this question of privilege. It shouldn't have happened that way. It needn't have happened that way, but it happened because of the arrogance of this government, Mr. Speaker. And it does raise a question as to how did that happen? Why did it happen? Why was the government so determined to extinguish the rights of honourable members to defend members' privileges? Well, the answer, Mr. Speaker, is that had the motion passed the House of Commons, it would have been referred to the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs, where it would have received precedence, just as it receives precedence in this chamber. Now, Mr. Speaker, that happened to be an inconvenience to this government because, Mr. Speaker, this government was simultaneously trying to ram through at the Procedure and House Affairs Committee the rules of this place, the rules in terms of how Parliament functions. This government was trying to strip the rights and abilities of honourable members of this House to hold this government to account. Mr. Speaker, and so we got this mess. Now, Mr. Speaker, we say the government has backed off a little bit in terms of their efforts to ram through changes in the Procedure and House Affairs Committee, but while they backed off a little bit at the Procedure and House Affairs Committee, they nonetheless remain intent on shutting down debate on a most important question of privilege. So, Mr. Speaker, let me just say that what the government has done and is doing is wrong, it is undemocratic, it is an attack on all members of Parliament, and as a result it is an attack on all Canadians, because when the abilities of members of Parliament to speak and represent their constituents is impeded upon, that is something that impacts all Canadians who count on us to represent them here every single day. So, Mr. Speaker, we will continue, my colleagues will, in the opposition, will continue to do what is necessary to hold this government to account, to call on this government to respect this House, to respect this institution, to respect the ability of members of Parliament to stand up and vote on behalf of their constituents, and to respect the privileges afforded to all honourable members in this House. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires?